It's great to be with everyone even though I'm not there in person, where at least the Zoom is working. So let me first of all uh, indicate that uh, kind of the course that I will take in the 30 minutes, or perhaps a little bit shorter than I will take to address you. I will make kind of a broad brush presentation of four key points. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about central banking in general. Two, I will talk about Argentina's fatal attraction to central banking. Three, I'll talk about the convertibility episode from 1991 until 2001. And four, I will speak about dollarization. All these topics and subjects are ones in which the ratio of evidence to theory is very low. This is particularly strange to me in a field of money and banking that in principle is quite empirical. But in fact, we end up with many discussions, what Nobelist Ronald Coase called blackboard economics. A lot of hypothetical, a lot of theory, and very little evidence and to substantiate the discussion. When it comes to central banking versus alternative arrangements, the nirvana approach is usually employed. And what I mean by that, this nirvana approach, Professor Harold Demsetz was the one who put his finger on this long ago. And that is, central banks are always presented on the blackboard as if they're running with absolute perfection in an ideal setting. Whereas if they're compared to any alternatives, the alternatives are always operating imperfectly and as they do actually in the real world. Nothing in the real world operates perfectly. But the nirvana approach, blackboard economics, little evidence, a lot of theory, a lot of hypothetical. This is what we face in these discussions on the topics that we'll be addressing today. As far as I'm concerned, I've now spent about 35 years studying and being involved in implementing alternatives to central banking, one being currency boards and the other dollarization. And I find that the arguments in opposition to either dollarization or currency board systems, alternatives to central banking, are either invalid, unimportant, or irrelevant. And they fall into my Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read on these topics is either wrong or irrelevant. Now, let me make a few remarks on my first point, and that is central banking. Most people don't recall that central banking is actually a relatively new institution. In 1900, there were only 18 central banks in the world. By 1940, they'd grown to 40, including the BCRA, which was founded in 1935, as you'll recall. And today, we have 214 central banks in the world. Now, why this explosion of central banking after World War II in particular? I think there are three factors that led to this. One is Keynes's general theory and Keynesian economics, and the idea that you could fine-tune an economy and smooth out any business cycles that might rear their ugly heads. Again, this gets into a little bit the blackboard economics. According to the textbooks, you can fine tune with perfection and smooth things out very well by employing discretionary monetary, with central banks, monetary policies, and discretionary fiscal policies. So that was one thing that came, Keynes. The second thing that came is that at the end of the Second World War, there were almost 70 currency boards in the world, and most of those currency boards were located in countries that were, or territories that were colonial. And with the end of World War II, independence began, and all the newly independent countries were very inclined to dump any colonial institutions. And one of those colonial institutions happened to be the currency board systems that were operating. The third thing is the fact that we had the Bretton Woods arrangements that were spawned after the Second World War, and these included the establishment of the IMF and the World Bank. And of course, at the World Bank and IMF, you needed jobs for the boys. And what better place to start than to establish a lot of new central banks in newly independent countries where they didn't have the technical expertise to even run a central bank. So they needed a lot of help from the newly formed institutions in Washington, D.C. So those were kind of the three things that led to the elimination of, in fact, a lot of currency boards and the institution of an establishment of central banks. Now, in principle, this is quite interesting because if we, let me just quote Sir John Hicks, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, of course, and a high priest of economic theory. He put it this way when he was talking about central banking, and I'm quoting. Hicks said, on strict Ricardian principles, there should have been no need for central banks. No need for central banks. That's in principle. Now, in practice, if we look at central banks, particularly in emerging market countries, the record is just terrible. They have created a lot of inflation. They've created a lot of currency crises. They've created a lot of banking crises. And in short, they've been great destabilizers. So that's the general picture of central banking versus, by the way, the alternative arrangements. The alternative arrangements, you have lower inflation, lower budget deficits, fewer banking crises, fewer currency crises, and a great deal more stability when you look at the alternatives, such as either currency boards or dollarization. Now let's jump to Argentina. And if we look at Argentina, it really validates Hanke's schoolboy theory of history. That is, it's just one damn thing after another. Let's talk about crises. The major crises in Argentina: 1876, 1890, 1952, 1958, 1967, 1975, 1985, 1989, 2001, and the clock is still running. You're right in the middle of a big crisis at present in Argentina. If we look at recessions, more specifically, from 1950 to 2023, you've had 16 years where the economy has been in a full-blown recession. GDP per capita. Today, GDP per capita is probably about where it was in 1974 in Argentina. Debt. Argentina is one of the biggest deadbeat countries in the world. There have been 3 sovereign defaults just since 2000. Recidivism. Since 1956, when Argentina joined the IMF, it's had 22 IMF programs. I would argue that none of those have been successful. Now, what's the source of this? If we look in broad strokes, we've got two factors going on. One is Peronism, and that is really nothing more than economic fascism with Argentine characteristics. The best article on this actually is by Wilhelm Röpke. It's called Fascist Economics, and it was published in 1935 in Economica. He wasn't talking about Argentina, but last year, Professor Newland and Emilio Ocampo wrote a great chapter called Public Debt Sustainability. It was in my book I edited with Barry Paulson and John Merrifield. That book was Public Debt Sustainability, International Perspectives, and Newland and Ocampo go through Peronism in some detail, a very excellent scholarly review of that. The second aspect of that is also brought up in a chapter in that same book on fiscal and monetary anomie written by Ocampo. So you have Peronism and this anomie in Argentina. Now, anomie, just to remind you, fiscal and monetary anomie means that whatever the statutory laws are, or even the constitutional laws, they just aren't followed. I mean, if there's a law in Argentina, people just don't follow it. They just do their own thing. And that comes in and is wedded with Peronism. That is part of the general system in broad strokes. Let's move to the specific problem in Argentina, and that is the BCRA, the central bank. And the central bank has discretion. It uses it with reckless abandon. And as a result of that, there's no hard budget constraint on the fiscal system. So the only way there are two ways you get a hard budget constraint in the fiscal system. One is to remove the monetary discretion and the ability to monetize deficits that are produced by the fiscal system. And the second thing is to have some sort of constitutional rules controlling and reining in the budgetary system. The big problem with anomie, and this is the main real justification for dollarization in Argentina, it's the anomie. No matter what the rules are, no matter what the laws are, the politicians just don't follow them. So the only way to remove the cancer from the system, the cancer being the central bank, is to mothball the peso and mothball the central bank and just get them out of the system. Then there is no rule or no institution that can be manipulated. You've substituted the dollar for the peso and eliminated the central bank. The next topic I'd like to briefly mention, because it's highly misunderstood and something I was involved in quite deeply from the start, and that's convertibility. Now, convertibility is not a currency board, point number one, because there was a lot of discretion allowed in the convertibility system. And also the convertibility system was housed in the BCRA, the central bank. So the currency board, an orthodox currency board, is a standalone institution with no discretionary powers whatsoever. And it puts a hard budget constraint in the fiscal system. But let's go through convertibility in my experience, just to update you on that or reflect on it for a minute. I met Carlos Menem in 1989, and right after he was elected, and the problem was, as you know, triple-digit inflation. And Menem had ideas about modernizing the economy and reforming the economy, more or less along the lines of what they'd been doing with the Chicago boys in Chile. But he wasn't getting anywhere. He was dead in the water. No one thought he was credible. No one thought he was going to accomplish anything. And he asked me what I thought should be done, and I said the first thing he has to do is kill inflation. I said, and that would give him credibility. And if he gained credibility, he might get some reforms done. So he said, well, how would you do that? And I said, I think what you should do is put in an orthodox currency board. So at the time, he suggested that I write this up, and I did with Kurt Schuler, my longtime colleague. And we published in 1991 a book that was published by the Foundation Republica. It was called Banco Central, or Caja de Conversion. And the preface to that book was written by Jose Maria Ibarria, who was a member of Congress, and he was in the Alzagaray faction of the Congress. And they had enough votes and enough good argumentation that they pushed forward the idea of a currency board. Eventually, that idea was put into shape with the convertibility law, which was instituted in April 1st of 1991. Now, shortly after that, in October of 1991, precisely October 25th, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal called, the title was Argentina Should Abolish Its Central Bank. And the reason I wrote that is that there were so many loopholes in the convertibility law, so many ideas that were inconsistent with currency board rules, ideas that allowed for a great deal of discretion at what? The central bank, where the convertibility law was being implemented, that I concluded that eventually the loopholes would be used, the discretion would be used, and the whole system would blow up. That's what I said in October 1991. Well, as you know, it took 10 years for the thing to blow up. It took a long time, actually. And why did it blow up? One, convertibility allowed for a lot of discretion. And when I say that, there are various ways to measure it, but with a currency board system, if there are net domestic assets on the balance sheet of the monetary institution, those should be frozen, or they shouldn't exist at all. You should just have only foreign exchange reserves as assets in a currency board system. But if you do have any domestic assets, they should be frozen and immovable. It turns out that the net domestic assets on the BCR's balance sheet in 1990, particularly after 1995, were moving around wildly. From 1995 until the time the convertibility system was abandoned, the net domestic assets on the BCRA's balance sheet were 6 times more volatile than they were in the central bank of Chile, and Chile was operating with a managed floating exchange rate. Now, what was going on? There was a lot of sterilization and neutralization going on at the BCRA during all the convertibility period. So that is one thing. The convertibility law itself allowed for this discretion. That's one point. The second point is that there was a lot of enemy going on. The convertibility rules were actually not being followed. The loopholes weren't big enough for the politicians involved, so they were breaking out of the loopholes and breaking the convertibility law. And then the last thing, which most people don't actually realize, is that the dagger in the heart of convertibility was actually rendered in November of 2001 by the IMF, because Horst Kohler and Ann Kruger at the IMF pulled the plug on disbursements of $1.3 billion in November of 2001 to Argentina, and that was the end. And they pulled the plug even though Argentina had been meeting its conditionality requirements. So Argentina was actually meeting the conditionality, and the IMF decided to pull the plug anyway. And that was the end of the system. Now, as far as my assessment of the actual performance of convertibility, and this is contrary to virtually all the narrative in the history about it, which the narrative is utter rubbish and not based on any facts whatsoever or distortions of facts. The performance of convertibility was pretty good. Relative performance was pretty good. Argentina had 10 pretty good years under the convertibility system. So let us move now to today in Argentina. And Carlos Newland had mentioned that I do measure the inflation rate every day. I just measured it today. Today, the inflation rate in Argentina is 244% per year. The official rate is 138.3%. So my measure, it's soaring above the official measure, and next month's official measure will certainly be higher than this month's. 2023, of course, is going to end up with one of those recession years with a negative growth of the IMF claims at about 2.5%. M3, the broad measure of money, is growing at 115% year over year, 115% year over year. Now, Hanke's golden growth rate, using the quantity theory of money and the equation of exchange, if you solve for that with the right numbers and use the inflation target of 5% in Argentina, that is the inflation target, by the way. The inflation target in Argentina is 5% annual inflation. I'm measuring at 244%. And what should the golden growth rate be? Hanke's golden growth rate should be about 10.5%. The BCRA should be growing the money supply, M3, at about 10.5% if they wanted to hit an inflation target of 5%. They're growing at 11 times faster than the golden growth rate. Now, let us jump to the end, and that is the hard budget constraint. Given enemy, it's time to mothball the peso and the BCR and put them in museums. Dollarization is both desirable and it's feasible. And in this case, I'm talking about somebody with some experience with this. I was the one who designed the dollarization program in Montenegro in 1999, where we replaced the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar with the Deutschmark. I was involved in implementing the Ecuadorian dollarization in 2001 when I was an advisor to the Minister of Economy, and also the dollarization in Zimbabwe, which lasted from 2009 to 2011. All these were done in very different circumstances. They all were successful, however, and led to huge confidence shocks. I might remark about Ecuador, since there's been a lot of talk and focus on Ecuador's dollarization in Argentina in the run-up to these presidential elections. The Sucre had plunged to 26,000 to 28,000, and President Mawad came on TV and he said, we're going to dollarize and the exchange rate's going to be 25,000. That was done with really not very much study, in my opinion. It ended up being a very big undervaluation of the Sucre. I think it should have been probably 20,000, maybe even 15,000. Anyway, it was successful. The only thing that happened because of this undervaluation of the initial exchange rate, it took a lot longer for the inflation rate in Ecuador to actually come down and approach the level in the US that would have been the case if a rate would have been maybe 15,000 or 20,000. That's kind of a technical point, but it's actually worth noting. When you look at the statistics of how long it took to adjust to US inflation levels, that's really the reason for it. The other thing I would like to remark about is that you had a president who came in, President Correa, and he was an adamant foe of dollarization, and he did every trick in the book to try to get around the hard budget constraint imposed by dollarization. And to some extent, he actually was successful because the central bank remained. So this gets to how you should dollarize. My last point, and I'll wind up with this last point. Number one, the hard budget constraint is obviously put in with the dollarization and the monetary authorities taken out of the picture. But in addition to that, I think there should be a budget rule, a constitutional rule also put in so that you avoid even the problems that they've encountered in Ecuador. And that would be a supermajority voting rule in which if the debt was to be increased in Argentina, it would take a supermajority vote of 2/3 of the Congress to approve it. Also included in that supermajority voting, if there were any new taxes or changes in the tax base for existing taxes, those would also require a supermajority vote of 2/3 of the Congress. So with that, Carlos, I have come to the conclusion of my opening remarks and overview on central banking in Argentina, dollarization, and budget constraints.